We find ourselves today in New York City, 1934, Columbia University. The reason why we are here is because there are interesting new developments in the field of anthropology. So, to get us situated, let's look here at a little bit from Steven Pinker's book, The Blank Slate, from the slides. In Chapter 2 of The Blank Slate, Pinker explains how Franz Boas's research led him to realize that the people of more primitive cultures were not in any way deficient. Their languages were as complicated as ours, allowing for complex morphology and neologisms. They were rich in meaning and could develop rapidly as when new numerical concepts were constructed as soon as society needed them. He still thought Western civilizations were superior, but he believed that all the peoples of the world could rise to this level. His students, however, took these ideas and turned them into moral relativism. Yes, that's the ethical theory we'll be covering today. Let me give you just a little bit more background. The story of the rise to prominence of cultural relativism is usually attributed to the work of Franz Boas and his students. Although Boas's position on cultural relativism was in fact somewhat ambiguous, he laid the groundwork for the full elaboration of cultural relativism by redirecting anthropology away from evolutionary approaches. So, prior to this time period, there was a tendency to put cultures into a hierarchy as less evolved and more evolved, on a spectrum of less evolved and more evolved. So that's what Boas was moving away from. Continuing. The flowering of classical cultural relativism awaited the work of Boas's students, including Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, and Melville Herskovits. Their articulation of a comprehensive relativist doctrine was appealing to intellectuals disillusioned by the pointless brutality of World War I, which undermined faith in the West's cultural superiority and inspired a romantic search for alternatives to materialism and industrialized warfare. So, the new techniques that were developed during this time period were novel, and it was an entirely new approach to the field itself, and it led to different approaches to how we value or how we assess the value systems of other cultures. From the slides, the ethnographer must interpret a culture on the basis of its own internal web of logic, rather than through the application of a universal yardstick. This principle applies to everything from language and kinship systems to morality and ontology. Complementing the core principle of cultural coherence is insistence that societies and cultures cannot be ranked on an evolutionary scale. Each must be seen as sui generis and offering a satisfying way of life, however repugnant or outlandish particular aspects of it may seem to outsiders. So a quick point to be made here about Boas before I get into cultural relativism. But over here on the top left, you see George Berkeley. Apparently Boas was actually heavily influenced by Berkeley. So that's kind of interesting. We've already covered him. Well, sort of. We covered one slide regarding Berkeley's views. But there is that slide in case you need a little reminder. Okay, one other thing before we go into cultural relativism. A quick story time. So some of you may have heard of the Battle of Thermopylae. That, of course, was when the Persians invaded Greece for the second time, and the Spartans plus some allies tried to hold them off at Thermopylae, hold them back for a second while forces back in Athens got everything ready for the invasion. So unfortunately, this is the only thing that people usually know about the Persian Empire, although it was much more important than that. It was a strong geopolitical player at the time, and it lasted 2 centuries. So it was a very important empire, and it shouldn't be relegated to just they invaded Greece twice, and that's we should know more about it than that. Most importantly, for our purposes, we should know about Cyrus the Great and his cylinder. Bit of a propaganda piece by him. Let me give you a little bit of info here about the cylinder from the slides. Because of its respectful tone and the humane treatment of deportees, some have classified the Cyrus cylinder as a charter of human rights. Human rights is a modern term and was not in use when the cylinder was written. There is, however, evidence of some awareness that humane treatment of people according to their natural rights was the correct way, even if the concept was never articulated. This includes avoiding violence and protecting people's lives regardless of their nationality, respecting their freedom to worship gods of their choosing, to live in their homeland, and the right to dwell in peace, all of which today embody the natural rights of people. All these ideas are reflected in the text and can be understood as part of a civilized and humane treatment of the conquered people of Babylon. It is noteworthy how Cyrus treated the people who were not his own people and had a different culture, language, and religion. Even after the conquest of Babylon, the dignity of its people was preserved. That, by the way, is from this book right here, The Cyrus Cylinder. The reason why I bring this up, and also these individuals right here, is because they seem to be espousing something similar to the view that we're covering today. But, even though Cyrus's foreign policy was very charitable, to say the least, and Herodotus, Protagoras, Zhuangzi each espoused some form of relativism, classical cultural relativism wasn't really thoroughly formulated and discussed until more recently. Of course, 1930s is what we're talking about. And that's actually the view we're covering today, classical cultural relativism. So, from here on out, I'll just describe it as cultural relativism. Here are the important concepts. Cultural relativism is the view that there is no objective way to establish that a particular morality is the correct morality. There is no reason to believe in a single true morality, even though there may be certain moral universals. So it might be the case that every single culture on earth does practice one same moral policy. The cultural relativists would still say that doesn't mean that there is one single true morality. It's much more organic than that. Each individual culture grows its own moral code. The main argument is there are major differences in the moralities that people accept, and these differences do not seem to rest on actual differences in situation or disagreement about the facts. For example, if you have a person from the US and a person from Peru discuss the different facts about a guinea pig, they might agree on its weight, its dimensions, how long it is, all those things. But there is still a major different moral policy going on here with regards to guinea pigs. In one culture, namely in the American culture, it's usually not okay to eat guinea pigs. But in Peru, they are, of course, a delicacy. And that seems to be a moral difference, even though there is no disagreement about the facts. It's simply the case that there are several kinds of moral principles, requirements, and permissions about what has to be done and what may be done, rankings of various things as better or worse, and specifications of morally virtuous or vicious actions and character traits, and these tend to vary widely across space and time. There just are different cultural practices that only make sense according to that internal logic. And they might seem strange at first. For example, the Muxes from Oaxaca, it's a third gender. It is not transgender, it is a third gender, and it's just a different set of permissions about what is allowable when it comes to gender. And in this case, there is a third gender. So that is a good example of just how cultures vary, and they might vary in various normative aspects. For example, even genders. Okay, so one way that the relativists sometimes describe their view is by appeal to the game analogy. If you're anything like me and you've tried to teach someone a board game, as you start playing the board game, first you tell them some rules, and then after you start playing, you remember all of a sudden, oh, that's right, I forgot, this can happen too. Oh, and there's this rule too. And a little bit later on, oh, I forgot to tell you about this. So we don't usually have all the rules to a game kind of at the forefront, at the fore of our mind. And it usually, as we play it, we remind ourselves of it. That's actually exactly what the cultural relativists are suggesting from the slides here. You may have a morality without being able to give anything like a precise specification of the principles of your morality, just as you are not able to give a precise specification of the rules of a board game or the grammar of your language. This second point is important. Other cultural relativists sometimes speak of a moral grammar, perhaps evolution programmed into us, this capacity to collect moral values. So we're born with this, this tendency to look for moral norms, and as we grow up and develop in our society, we figure out what the right things and the wrong things are. So this idea comes from Noam Chomsky, and more recently there's other views like that of Michael Tomasello, but I'll follow Chomsky's basic idea here. Chomsky believes that we have a universal grammar. It is a language acquisition device that is programmed into us by evolution, and that helps us grow a language. So it doesn't matter where we're born, we naturally acquire the language of that culture, of that place. In many cases, we acquire multiple languages easily. That's just because our universal grammar, our language acquisition device, that's what it does. And when we get older, it goes away. So that is what some relativists are suggesting about our moral values. It turns out that we can grow different moral codes depending on the society that we grow up in. So let me give here a quick side note. That I'm referring here to only the classical cultural relativists. There are other versions of cultural relativism, but here let me just specify something kind of unique about the classical approach to cultural relativism from the slides. Classical cultural relativists take the judgments to be true if they are true in relation to some salient moral framework, as opposed to something like moral fictionalism. So if you ask maybe a moral fictionalist, like maybe Hobbes was, is corporal punishment wrong? He might say something like false, like, look, this whole morality thing, it's all big fiction. It's every single statement that has some kind of moral judgment in it, it's all false. It's just this game that we play. But the relativists actually say something different. They say it's true with regards to some cultural code. So they have a relative notion of truth, which is kind of unique to them. To help you understand cultural relativism, here is a back and forth between an adherent and an opponent of CR. Objections to cultural relativism. Objection: the entailment argument. The relativist claims that because different cultures have different moral codes, then there is no universal moral code. But just because there is disagreement about an issue, that doesn't mean there isn't an objective fact of the matter. So what the opponent of cultural relativism is suggesting here is that there are some statements that you can be wrong about. For example, if you say that the basic shape of the Earth is actually a flat disk, well then you're wrong about that. Similarly, if you say that so-and-so weighs 248 pounds when it's really 148 pounds, you're just simply wrong about that. When we typically say so-and-so weighs 148 pounds, there is a right answer given some particular time period and some, point in space. There is a right answer. That is the weight, 148.8 pounds. So you can be wrong about those things. Those things are objective claims. And so what the opponent to cultural relativism is saying here is, yeah, some cultures may disagree on moral facts. That just means that one of them is wrong. Maybe they're all wrong, but there is an objective morality, and disagreement doesn't really undermine that in any way. Here is a response from the cultural relativist. That may be true with regards to the shape of the earth. In other words, statements with an objective truth value. But there are some things that have relative truth value. For example, our standards of beauty. Since there is so much variance in the moral codes of cultures, that could mean that moral values are relative rather than objective. So the relativist here is saying, look, there's just different kinds of statements with different kinds of truth values. Some of them are objective, like the shape of the earth, but some of them are relative. I'm sure you've had the case where your friend is talking about this new person they're dating, and they're so gorgeous, and then when you see that person, you're not really impressed. That's because most of us accept that beauty is relative. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So beauty can be true for one person. You can say this person is beautiful, and that's true for one person, but it's not true for someone else. What the relativist is suggesting is maybe morality is like that too. Okay, another objection. Argument from tolerance. The relativist claims that we must be accepting of all moral codes, but what if a society endorses intolerance? Must a tolerant society be tolerant of intolerance? Cultural relativism contradicts itself. Here, let's get into the informal fallacy of the day, because I think this might be a fallacy. Strawman argument. A strawman argument is an argument in which a speaker, A, exaggerates the position of an opponent, making it sound unreasonable, and then B, refutes the exaggerated position rather than the actual position. Now, this did happen to me. I'm not even sure what the conversation was anymore, but back in high school, I said something like, we should fund K through 12 a little bit better, or something like that. I'm not really sure what I said. And the teacher said to me something like the following. I'm paraphrasing here from the slides. If you want to reduce military spending, you clearly want soldiers to die. You're obviously crazy. Your view is false. So this teacher distorted my view and said, added a little, assumption in there. If you want to fund schools better, you must want to take the money away from the military, and that means you want them to die. I never said those other things. But at the time, when someone says this to you, you get a little confused. It's only later that you realize this is a straw man argument. So this might be the way that a cultural relativist responds to that argument. Cultural relativism doesn't necessarily endorse tolerance. Rather, it claims that what is right is simply what the society has deemed to be right. More precisely, it denies that there is any objective way to establish any moral code as the correct moral code. So if you look at the definition of cultural relativism again, nowhere in there does it say be tolerant. So their point is more nuanced. It is actually a point about relative truth when it comes to moral claims. So this presents a brand new dilemma for us. Dilemma number 6, is morality relative? We're currently in this whole discussion about ethical theories, and we've been seeing some problems with it. For example, it's possible that every single action we perform is out of self-interest. That is incompatible with most moral codes. It's incompatible with free will, maybe. Here is another problem to add to the mix. How do we know morality is objective at all? So we need to solve this one too if we're trying to solve all the dilemmas back to dilemma number 1. Let me say one other thing here, just as a second reminder, that there's actually multiple versions of cultural relativism, and that I'm only covering classical cultural relativism. So from the slides, it is important to remember, however, that there are many different characterizations of the view, some stronger than others. I am covering classical cultural relativism.